So, hello and welcome. My name is Victoria Keane, and I'm from Homes England's Local Government Capacity Centre. I'm delighted to welcome you to our summer learning programme, and this is our third session. We've got 2 weeks of 18 different sessions. These are a series of knowledge sharing sessions on topics that you've told us that are of interest to you. And today's event is called An Introduction to Community-Led Housing. So the Summer Learning Programme is brought to you by Homes England's Local Government Capacity Centre. And this slide summarises who we are and what we do. We launched the centre following extensive research and consultation with you across local government and with a whole range of other partners to determine where authorities most need support and how this can best be delivered. And we look forward to hearing from you after this session with the polls and also the more detailed survey so you can help us shape our offer to you in the future. Next slide, please. So on the screen now, you can see the agenda for today's session. So in a moment, we're going to hear from Tom Chance, who's going to tell us more about community-led housing. What is it? We'll then hear from Matthew Dodd, who's going to go through the Homes England role in community-led housing. We'll then hear from Anna Bailey about supporting community-led housing. Bryony Stevens and Louise Davidson will join us to talk about their experience of land disposal for community-led housing. And we'll be joined by a number of other guests to go through a Q&A. So absolutely put in your questions in the chat and we'll respond to those. Okay, next slide, please. So this session, we'll discuss what is community-led housing, how Homes England can support it, how to create a policy framework for community-led housing, as well as examples of successful delivery from partners, including how to deliver community-led housing at scale. Within the session, you'll hear 2 contrasting examples on how to support community-led housing, both within a rural and urban setting. The presentation will cover the challenges of delivering community-led housing, as well as insight and lessons learned. But before we get into the detail, I'll hand over now to Tom Chance, the Chief Executive of the Community Land Trust, to give us an introduction to the topic. Over to you, Tom. Thank you.
Thanks, Victoria. Good afternoon, everyone. So if we go straight into my next slide. While I begin to talk about it, we've got a second poll coming up, which is you can type in any options you want in this, I understand. What are the barriers that you have experienced or that you perceive to engaging with community-led housing? So if the poll will come up in the chat, you should be able to start putting in some suggestions to that. And then once that's up, if we go to the next slide. While that's doing it, I should probably say a bit more about who I am. So I'm the Chief Executive of the Community Land Trust Network. We're a membership body of community land trusts across England and Wales. There are about 340 of them. Apparently my video isn't showing. Hopefully that works now. And CLTs have built or own or manage about 1,700 homes and have around 7,000 in the pipeline. Okay, here we go, the barriers are coming through, that's great. So we go on to the next slide. I want to talk about barriers in terms of useful myths, and this quote from Karl Popper, I'm not a great fan of in other respects, but I think this is a really useful way to think about it. That often the stories we hear about something like community-led housing can have a grounding in truth, but are the basis on which we then try to improve rather than the inherent problems or issues with a particular approach. So to take the first example, we often hear people saying community-led housing is very slow, isn't it? And there are examples of extremely slow projects, and it's interesting to look at why they were slow and then to learn from that. But if we look across the sector as a whole, a study was done recently by an academic from Sheffield Hallam University looking at a wide range of projects, a sample of them, and he found that all things being equal, they're no slower than a housing association or private developer or other forms of development. And actually, sometimes the perception came either from extreme examples or from the fact that you might not hear about a housing developer working on a proposal until it's relatively late, particularly say if you work in planning and control, you would only hear about it when the application comes in for a pre-app, for example. Whereas with community-led housing, you might have heard about it from the first meeting in a pub, years before they even get to identifying a site and securing it. But there are lots of things in these myths that are useful for us to think about. And so the amount of work that it takes, ensuring that it does actually deliver, that it doesn't necessarily need any greater level of grant just because it's community-led. And then there are those that are just plain wrong. So for example, the idea that it's a middle class pursuit, we did some analysis with the Office for National Statistics of community land trusts, and they are overrepresented in the most deprived parts of the country. And the main focus of their projects is social rent housing. So they're actually the opposite of middle class in terms of who they're looking to benefit and where they're based. If we go to the next slide. This is a useful working definition of community-led housing, which appears in various places, including the prospectus for the Community Housing Fund, which Homes England and the GLA ran. And it's designed not to, well, to be fairly broad and encompass a whole range of community-led approaches, but also draw a bit of a line around it to distinguish community-led housing from other forms of community involvement or community engagement. So, for example, ways in which a local community might get very involved in a consultation process for a development coming forward, or neighbourhood planning, or so on. And so the key features are that the community group there is a community group which is deeply involved in and has a decision-making role throughout the development process. Not necessarily right from the start, but at a reasonable stage, they should get involved and actually be decision makers. That they ultimately choose what form of role they have, whether they aspire to own and manage and do everything themselves, or whether they want to work in partnership with others, and what that partnership looks like, it's their choice. And that if there are benefits in a particular proposal, like there are some affordable homes or there are some community facilities, those have to be defined and protected, so they don't. It's not that the community disappears or is no longer involved or no longer is able to keep those benefits after a certain period of time. And under those three parameters, there are a huge range of different sorts of things that you can do. Next slide, please. These are just taken from a recent statement from Stuart Andrew, our current latest housing minister. They would look fairly similar if you went back over the last 5 years to whichever housing minister was talking about why government supported it. Some things like modern methods of construction have obviously risen up the agenda. But there's a recognition that community-led housing, broadly speaking, both brings more housing forward, but also improves the quality of the homes and enriches the communities in which it's built. And so when you think about the barrier of time and how much time community-led housing is perceived to take, then sometimes that time can be an investment in something that is going to sustain local communities. The government, for example, commissioned some research which it published last year showing an appreciable reduction in loneliness and an improvement in social cohesion from community-led housing projects compared to other types of housing provision. I think that would be an interesting time, Victoria, to hear about the results from that poll before I just go and talk about some of the models.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we take a look, so in terms of the barriers facing local authorities or communities, we've got funding as probably the biggest. That's had 29 likes, and lots of people are responding to that. Land availability, access to land, lack of land. So land obviously is a real barrier. Community engagement is there, lack of knowledge. So I think really there we've got funding, land, and knowledge and capacity, probably the big areas there.
Great, yes. And I suppose land and funding you could put down against any sort of affordable housing programme, but there are particular challenges for communities because what you're normally talking about in these projects is a new organisation coming forward and wanting to do something, and also wanting to do something quite ambitious. And so they're undercapitalised. They are often amateurs, which is at the heart of it. It's sort of a positive thing. They may often be professionals in their own lives. Within a group you might have, if you're lucky, somebody who's got a background in architecture or planning or something like that. But they are groups of people who are undercapitalised, lack all the skills that they need. And so the challenge for us all is, how do we get them to the point where they can access land, where they can access finance, and where they can access support? And local authorities have historically had a really strong role in doing that. And I think from what we'll hear from East Cambridgeshire and Bristol, two very compelling examples of how councils have tried to address those three barriers, in part through what they do and complementing what Homes England do, which Matt will talk about, and also what we do as a membership body. So next slide. So I've described this as patterns rather than models, if you're familiar with the idea of pattern books and pattern development, because you can combine these different patterns that I'm going to describe together into projects, and they're not always like it's either a community land trust or it's a co-housing or what have you. But the three most common terms you might come across. So a community land trust is about a local community, which might mean in a rural context, a parish, or in an urban context, a town or part of a city. And that community comes together to set up an organisation through which it can develop assets for the benefit of its community. And they don't just do housing, but housing is a very common one for community land trusts. And the reason you might want to think about community land trusts and why you might want to support them is because they can increase public engagement and support in development and give communities a much stronger role in the long-term stewardship and protection of those assets. And on asset locking, for example, CLTs are exempt from the right to shared ownership, they're exempt from the right to buy. Will remain to be seen if we retain that, if the government extends the right to buy, but they have strong means to protect affordable homes. And they are also defined in law in a way that clearly aligns them with local government duties for sustainable development and well-being. So they're a strong vehicle through which to support development in partnership with the private sector and the third sector. And they have demonstrably increased public support for housing in places like sensitive rural areas or awkward urban infill sites. Next slide. The second common term is co-housing. And co-housing communities are where people have typically their own private homes, but they share facilities because they want to live in a strong community together and be more mutually supportive. And so the classic co-housing, as I've said, you have a common house, which is a home with some bedrooms and maybe a kitchen, maybe a living space, and all the people who live there have access to it. And in some cases, people might live in a home with fewer spare bedrooms of their own, and they have a common house. So if you want your family to visit, they can go and stay in the common house, and you then don't need everybody to have one or two spare bedrooms for the sake of visitors. Why? Because they are a very strong way to being much more cohesive communities and to provide much more mutual aid. They are not a replacement for formal care, but if you look at the example of older women's co-housing in North London in particular, there you've got a group of women over the age of 50 who are able to support each other through the different stages of their lives from different generations. And the intergenerational side is very strong as well, and needn't only be over 50s. Often you've got co-housing communities where you want to have families, young, right from very young to very elderly, all living together and supporting one another and living in community. And in some cases, co-housing can become an anchor community for larger new developments. And sometimes community land trusts have actually approached it in this way. That if you've got a new development somewhere and you want to bring in a strong community, co-housing, it can be a good way to do that. Next slide. Cooperatives are about residents democratically controlling their homes, and they've been quite an interesting approach for self-build. For example, if you're concerned that self-build is all grand designs, self-build co-ops make that affordable to people on lower incomes. Very good way to empower tenants and sort of go one step further than things like tenant management organisations. And there's a growing interest in student co-ops where there's particular issues around affordability and quality, and students are able to organise together and set up these co-ops. Next slide. One big change in recent years, which comes back to some of those barriers, is the development of a network of professionals, which we have been supporting and government has invested in. So these enabler hubs exist across the country over different geographies, and it's worth looking yours up because they are able to support you and local community groups to develop projects in a way that is faster, more likely to deliver, reaching more people. Next slide. So in conclusion, you're going to hear some fantastic examples about what community-led housing has looked like, but in a way, I would encourage you to think about your own housing strategies, your own planning policies, and think how could you be initiating or supporting community-led housing and injecting some of the DNA of CLH into what's going on in your area, and working with your local enabler hub to try to find more replicable patterns. Of course, if you've got a project on your doorstep, find pragmatic ways to support it, but this could be a much larger part of your local market. And I think you'll hear from Bristol on these CAMs where they're beginning to achieve that. So that's me. I hope that's helpful, and I'll hand over to Matt.
Hello, everyone. Thanks very much, Tom, for that really interesting introduction to today's session. I'm going to talk a little bit about how Homes England has supported community-led housing and how it can support it going forward. For those who don't know me, I'm a Senior Affordable Housing Strategy Manager, and I lead on rural housing and community-led housing as part of that role. So can we have the next slide, please? Great. So, as the slide says, Homes England's got a desire to diversify and the commitment to diversify the housing sector. And we've always seen community-led housing and community-led development as a key part of that. We have supported various types of community-led housing projects over the years. So I thought I'd just note the ones that we've had in the past and also what we are currently looking at doing. So we first, well, initially many years ago, predecessor organisations such as the Housing Corporation were involved in funding cooperative housing, but in more recent times, the sort of initially looked at funding community land trusts when we ring fenced part of the 2011-2015 Affordable Homes Programme. And that saw a number of schemes being delivered across the country. There was quite significant delivery in the south of England with partnerships with housing associations. But that was one of the first sort of times when we as an agency recognised how we could support community-led development. Following on from that, we delivered a project called the Community-Led Project Support Fund, which was a really wide-ranging revenue support fund program that government introduced and home or the HCA as we were then delivered. This supported a wide variety of different community-led organisations and allowed us to recognise the importance of revenue funding to support and deliver those early stage projects. Around 50% of the projects that we supported with relatively small scale grants were housing projects, and many of those went on to deliver homes and access other funding through us. We also helped deliver such wide variety of projects such as wellbeing centres in Bristol, community paths. We supported community dance centres and a number of different types of project that showed demonstrated to us how important some of these community organisations are to the communities that they serve. So that was a really interesting fund to be part of. And then more latterly, and Tom's already mentioned this one briefly, we delivered the Community Housing Fund up until the year before last. And through the Community Housing Fund, we delivered 4 different types of funding. So we delivered revenue funding directly to groups to do feasibility studies and to look at the site identification, planning, the different types of surveys that are needed to get housing development off the ground. So that was one part of the funding, and a really well liked, I think, type of funding that again revenue funding, which is always hard to come by, and was heavily subscribed to. Secondly, we were able to fund local authorities with some revenue funding to enable them to develop policies and programs of community-led support. We also then had capital to fund small scale infrastructure to unlock sites, which, as we saw in the poll that came up earlier, accessing land, the right type of land, one of the major barriers. So although this part of the funding wasn't heavily subscribed, because it was slightly complex in its nature, where it was taken up, it led to successful development, and I think would be a popular one moving forward if we were able to do that again. And then finally, we had capital funding, which was available for projects that, alongside the affordable homes program that we were running at the time, but perhaps had a different tenure mix. So those are the things that we've delivered in the past, but alongside that, and what we're doing going forward, is we still see community-led development as important. Obviously, we're guided by government funding, but in the funds that we currently have, the affordable homes program I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail in a minute. But we see, and government sees, community-led housing as a key sort of levelling up tool. It's a key way for communities to be able to level up. And not noted on here, but coming through recently, the response to the Bacon review on self-build and self-commissioned housing has asked Homes England to become involved in a unit to promote self-commissioned housing, which will include community-led housing, and we're just working with government to look at what that might look like and how we will be able to support that going forward. So self-build, as mentioned earlier, there are community-led self-build schemes. So as part of the self-commissioned housing route, we're looking at self-custom build and also community-led housing. So I think that's quite an exciting development as we move forward. But at the moment, there's not that much we can say on it, and we're working with government to develop that self-commissioned housing piece of work within Homes England. Can we have the next slide, please? So I talked about the Affordable Homes Programme 26, which is actually 2021 to 26. And as part of that, we're delivering around £7 billion of affordable housing grant. And there are two main routes that is being delivered. Many of you will have seen we have already allocated around £5 billion to strategic partners. And they will deliver around 90,000 homes over the next 5 years. So that's a considerable investment in that. And what was encouraging to see was that a number of those very large housing associations, who are not always traditionally thought of when we think about community-led housing, have committed to deliver some community-led homes as part of that, as part of their strategic partnership bids. So it's important that we support them and try and make other housing association partners understand the benefit there, so that they can go on to do that too. Continuous market engagement, the remainder of the money for individual schemes. We're keen to support community-led entities where we can, whether that's in partnership with other housing associations or as standalone schemes. And details of all those, the Affordable Homes Programme, I'm sure many of you know about it, but that can all be found on our websites. What I want to do now is just touch on a couple of examples of where we funded them. So can we have the next slide, please? So this is a co-housing scheme in Leeds. So it's quite a large scheme. 29 of the total 59 will be for Chapeltown co-housing, and I think this is an interesting scheme because of the variety of different types of accommodation and different types of funding that have gone into that. So the Community Housing Fund was able to support some through revenue funding, capital funding through the Shared Ownership Affordable Homes Programme, and also the sort of site remediation funding that can be so important through the Housing Infrastructure Fund. And then finally, and you can also see on that scheme, actually, I mentioned self-build earlier, that includes some self-build plots as well. And then can we go on to the next slide, please, as well? Thank you. Now, this scheme, I wanted to put in particular with my other hat on because it's Rural Housing Week, but it just shows also what great stuff can be done in rural areas. So this is a CLT who led the neighbourhood plan process. And following that, we're able to apply for Community Housing Fund pre-development funding, decided that the work they did through that, they decided that they could partner with a small housing association and are delivering a rural exception site with 10 affordable homes and 1 self-build service plot. We talked, or Tom talked earlier, about driving higher standards through community-led housing. These will be built to passive house standards, which is sort of, a really innovative way of doing things, particularly in rural areas, particularly if we look at things like the cost of living crisis today. And so driving innovation is something that we're keen to support through these sort of things. So again, this is funded through the Affordable Homes Programme, as well as the initial Community Housing Fund, and working closely with Whitehorse and Wiltshire Council to support what is a really important scheme. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a flavour of some of the Homes England support. I'm going to pass on to Anna Bailey now. So we go to the next slide. There we go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Anna Bailey. I'm leader of East Cambs District Council, where I've been a councillor for 15 years. And I also wear another hat in that I am trustee and chair of East Cambs Community Land Trust, which I'll talk a little bit about later. Next slide, please. So just to say, I noticed a question in the chat about how local authorities how can they go about promoting and encouraging the establishment of community land trusts, and I do have a whole slide on it, but I think, in essence, it's about taking away the barriers and making it as easy an environment as possible to let people get on with what it is that they're trying to achieve. And I think it is really helpful if you can actually get one up and running, because there is nothing better than seeing it in the flesh for real. But I have a slide on it later. So the East Cambs District Council approach to community-led development. Just a bit of background. East Cambs is a very small, one of the smallest in the UK, actually. It's a rural district council. And our local plan concentrates development on 3 market towns. That's Littleport, Soham, and the small cathedral city of Ely. The district does suffer with expensive house prices. We have the effect of Cambridge on our communities, and we do have large levels of outcommuting to London and Cambridge. We've been trying to promote an environment where people can actually realise the dream of living and working locally with high quality jobs and high quality, truly affordable housing. So we have taken a very deliberate approach to encourage and facilitate and support community-led development. We were the first local authority to adopt a local plan policy. We did this in our 2015 local plan that facilitates delivery of community-led development. So our policy Growth 6 does actually give preferential treatment to community-led development, allowing sites outside of the building line, but importantly in sustainable locations, to come forward. And the community is able to extract far greater value from the uplift in land values than on sort of normal sites. And I saw another question in the chat about how community groups can unlock funding, and that is the key way that we have been approaching this in East Cambridgeshire. It is the uplift in land values that is able to support much greater community benefit being extracted from the increase in the land value. So the CLT owned assets, of course, also provide an income for the community in perpetuity. We've also worked hard to support our community land trusts by having policies and promises embedded in our corporate priorities. So it is part of our corporate plan as a district council and very much in the culture of our organisation. We've also got a directly employed in-house community-led development advisor who is able to provide support and impartial advice to both community groups that are trying to establish, as well as CLTs that are well on the way. Emily Howard is actually with us on the call today, so she's very happy to answer questions as well. We've got 22 incorporated community land trusts in our small district, including East Cambs Community Land Trust, which is an umbrella organisation that can support communities that don't have an established CLT in their area, but would like to benefit from community-led and owned housing. We also provide financial support, and this is really important. So we offer a £5,000 startup grant to help groups become incorporated and carry out early work. And we've recently approved a £100,000 grant fund for community land trusts to apply for support with pre-development costs, for example, feasibility studies or site investigations, professional fees, community consultation, planning application fees, for example. Next slide, please. So we're just going to take the opportunity to do another little poll. I would very much like to hear from you in your location about whether your local authority in your patch, what they're up to on this subject. So we're going to have another poll, and the results, I think, are going to come up in the chat. So the question is, does your local authority have a policy or guidance document to support community-led development? And if you could click on the poll in the chat to participate. And I can see the results are flying in quite quickly. We've got a little bit more in favour of no than yes at the moment, and some in development. So we'll keep an eye on that as we carry on through. So while we let people answer that, if we could move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so a little bit about some of our completed schemes in East Cambridgeshire. So Streatham and Wilburton Community Land Trust is the most mature CLT site in our district. In the settlement of Streatham, which lies on just next to the A10 on the way from Ely to Cambridge. It's got 75 properties. They're a mix of open market and 23 affordable rental properties. It's a beautiful, low density, very high quality, 10-year blind development with huge open green spaces, flexible business units on site, a woodland walk, and they've got a new GP premises coming to the site as well, which was something that the local community really wanted to see. And all the planting on the site is edible, which is lovely. The affordable rents being achieved there are well below social rent levels. And obviously they have the flexibility to flex those according to people's needs and requirements. And they've got plans to extend with a further 9 CLT properties in their phase 4. And the other one on that slide is Soham Thrift CLT. This was built by the District Council's wholly owned trading company, East Cambs Trading Company, the property arm of which trades as Palace Green Homes. And I think, you know, Palace Green Homes has developed real expertise and hand-holding capabilities to support trustees through the process, and is seen as a valued partner to some of the CLT sites where the trading companies actually built out those sites. Just having a check on the little poll about whether your local authority has any policy guidance or support documents in place. We've got 21% of people saying yes, 36% of people saying no, and 12% in development, with 29% of people who aren't aware. So there's clearly some work and effort required there by the sounds of it. Okay, if we could move on to the next slide, and I'll just tell you a little bit more about some of the other sites. Hadnham Community Land Trust is another site that was built by Palace Green Homes, the District Council's wholly owned trading company. It's another low density development with beautiful open green spaces, sits on the top of the only hill, frankly, almost in East Cambridgeshire. And the CLT owns 11 affordable rent and 2 shared ownership properties, and they've got plans to take on a further 6 this year, so they're going great guns. Did extensive community engagement activity to ensure that this development went smoothly with the local community. And in Swaffham Prior, the Community Land Trust decided to partner with a housing association to take on the stewardship of their 8 affordable rental homes. But the CLT retained the allocation rights there, so that the homes are still reserved for people with the strongest ties to the village. And Swaffham Prior CLT is becoming nationally well known because they are currently digging up roads and delivering a community heating scheme, which offers all 500 homes in the village the opportunity to move away from mainly oil based, because it's a rural location, to locally produced renewable energy. Next slide, please. The top one there is the organisation that I am the chair of, East Cambs CLT, the umbrella organisation. So the trading company Palace Green Homes was building out 2 sites. The first one, which was a location owned by the District Council, a car park essentially in central Ely, so brownfield site. And it was a development of 11 properties, 2 of which the CLT have taken on the ownership and stewardship of, 1 rental and 1 shared ownership. Beautiful, high quality housing for local people. And East Cambs CLT is also taking on, the District Council negotiated with the MOD, who owned an old RAF based housing site, also in Ely, where the local community hugely frustrated because the houses had sat empty for many, many years. 88 properties on that site, beautiful tree-lined avenues, and the District Council took on that site and passed it over to the trading company to refurbish those properties, and the East Cambs CLT is taking on 15 shared ownership properties there, which wouldn't have happened if a private developer had taken on that site, because they are refurbishments, not new properties. Next slide, please. Other developments in the pipeline, we've got Swaffham Bullbeck Community Land Trust planning a really beautiful looking development of 45 properties, where 18 will be owned by the CLT, again for allocation to local people. And Streatham and Wilburton, who've already delivered in Streatham, has a new site in Wilburton, the village next door, which is at the planning application stage for up to 115 properties. And extensive community spaces and commercial units, and the CLT would take on ownership of 35 affordable homes and 25 acres of public open space, if that is successful at getting planning permission. And Kennet Garden Village has achieved planning permission for a mixed tenure development of 500 homes, adopting Garden Village principles, where the CLT will take on 60 affordable units. And I've got a slide dedicated to Kennet in a second, because it's a site where community-led development is really delivering at some scale. Next slide, please. So what really has all this activity and effort actually achieved? You can see there that there's a list of a lot of bricks and mortar type infrastructure, which is benefiting our communities, and lots of it owned by those communities. But actually, I think, as Tom was saying earlier, it's about a lot more than that. It's about building communities and social cohesion. It's about extracting much greater value from the uplift in land values for the community, for the benefit of the community. And of course, it is delivering an income for the community in perpetuity. And it's about retaining the allocation rights. It's about building local homes which are by local people for local people. And those people are often people that are shut out of the local housing market in East Cambs. And now they've got the ability to live and work locally. And I think more than anything, it does give the community a sense of control and actual control over development that's happening in their area, which makes it more acceptable because they feel it's not being forced upon them. Next slide, please. So just to hone in a little bit on Kennet Community Land Trust, the Garden Village Principles development, and you can see there what it means to the trustees of Kennet CLT. It's our largest site in East Cambs, and it's not always been easy for the trustees of Kennet CLT. This site, it is large, it's taken quite a long time to come forward, and I pay tribute to the trustees of Kennet, who over many years have voluntarily invested hours of time and their expertise, and frankly, sometimes their personal reputations into their vision. And I truly believe it's going to be a really great development to be proud of. Next slide, please. So what's it all about at Kennet? Kennet is currently a sort of string development village running along a very busy road with a number of about 150 homes. So it's a very tiny community, but it does have the benefit of a railway station, and it is located near to the A14. So, it does have good transport links. Kennet Garden Village is a residential development of 500 mixed tenure homes, bearing in mind that I told you that, it's only 150 houses currently. And that includes 25 self-build plots, 100 K homes that are available to purchase for £100,000 for first-time buyers, and 150 affordable homes, 60 of which will be owned in perpetuity by Kennet CLT. And for those who aren't familiar with 100k homes, it was a policy of the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Combined Authority until recently. It's effectively a forerunner to the government's new First Homes policy, and it allows first-time buyers to purchase 100% of the freehold ownership at discounted rates, but where the discount stays with the property in perpetuity, so that the next purchaser can also benefit from the same percentage discount. And we will be delivering 100k homes at the Kennet site. It is different. So Kennet, the community-led development here took an infrastructure first approach. They wanted the infrastructure to be delivered early on. That is quite demanding when you think about, you know, funding and the ability to do that. They've secured through Section 106 early delivery of the infrastructure that the community chose to bring forward. So early in the first phase, delivery of a new primary school, off-site highways improvements, a new perimeter road, a village green, open spaces, a site office for the CLT and other community facilities. And it's a sustainable low carbon development with there's a commitment to reach near net zero. It's a partnership development, so there are 4 principal stakeholders: Bellway Homes, who's building out the site, East Cambs Trading Company, Kennet Community Land Trust and the landowners. And we formed a delivery board that's basically responsible for ongoing monitoring of the design and build, essentially sticking to the promises that have been made to the community. And finally, the final slide, please. So what's next in East Cambs? Our ultimate vision for East Cambridgeshire is really to have the most advanced community-led housing sector in the UK, where local people in confident and resilient communities have got access to attractive local homes that they can genuinely afford. And so we are very committed to community-led development long term, and we continue to work with communities to unlock those barriers that do exist. And we also are committed to continuing to offer our free advice and support to interested groups and those startup grants. And also we're launching our newly approved 100k pre-development grant to support groups with that gap in funding that can exist, to provide more certainty and avoid the delays for CLTs, so that they can access the funding they need to move forward. So I want to say thank you to Homes England for inviting East Cambs District Council to this event. I'd very much like to hand over now to Louise Davison, who's the Housing and Strategy and Enabling Manager from Bristol City Council. Louise, over to you.
Thank you. Right, yes, no, I'm Louise Davison. I head up the Strategy and Enabling team at Bristol City Council, and I'm going to be joined in this bit of the presentation by Bryony Stevens, who's an Enabling Manager who works in the Enabling team here. Now, we are both new to Bristol, relatively new to Bristol City Council, so we have moved into almost an implementation phase with a load of the policy work that was done on community-led housing sort of being there when we joined the local authority. But we both have previous experience in other parts of our lives of working within a community-led housing remit. So can I have the next slide, please? So Bristol has, as a city, a deep root in activism. Many people have heard of Bristol in terms of its riots and its activism. Of late, we've had the Black Lives Matter riots and the toppling of Edward Colston's statue. But that activism, actually over the years, has also been seen within the housing movement. Right back sort of to the early 200s, 2020, sorry, we've had development by organisations as Ashley Vale Action Group in St Werburgh's, and the Bristol Community Land Trust was set up over a decade ago in the city. So we have that history for us. We have strong community anchor organisations who work within geographic areas of the city, but we also have huge community interest of non-geographic, if you like, housing groups who want to build and deliver their own homes for their communities. That creates slight tensions for us. We don't know how to quite define that community, but we have a real groundswell of interest in delivery of affordable housing through the communities in the city. We've got a high housing need, we've got high affordability pressures and a real crisis in the city. And we were lucky to be one of the areas that benefited from community-led funding back in 2019. And we did have, you know, a creation of a hub, a West of England hub for community-led housing. And we were lucky enough as a local authority to have a dedicated community-led housing role for the City Council. That role has now passed on. We don't have the funding for that anymore, and the work is delivered within our strategy and enabling team. I'm going to hand over now to Bryony, who actually takes on that lead for us in the city, and she's going to take you through some of the work streams and talk about the land disposals policy.
Hi, next slide, please. Thanks, Louise. And I think one of the first things to say about the Bristol context, in comparison to what we've just heard from East Cambs, is that this is obviously an urban setting, and we don't have the same kind of scale of development, greenfield development. We don't have the rural exception site policy to draw upon in terms of bringing down land values on development sites. The other thing to stress, which is very different from other councils that I've worked for over the last few years, since community-led housing has been a thing that's been promoted by government, is that Bristol still has council housing. And I think that's a key thing to bear in mind here. And one of the reasons that we have more sites at our disposal that we can make available for community-led housing than probably a lot of other authorities. So just to sum up some of the work streams we're currently undertaking, and then we're going to focus in on how our land disposal policy works. So we have this land disposal policy that, as Louise says, was adopted when we had the dedicated worker for community-led housing. She did a lot of work identifying sites and getting this policy through Cabinet. And that led us to have release 11 sites in the first tranche, 6 of which received bids, and we're now supporting groups to take those sites forward. Some sites with existing community anchor organisations. We also have some sites with community anchor organisations that weren't part of that tranche of disposals, but have kind of evolved as community-led housing projects. We've also got the We Can Make project, which we're not going to focus on here, but that's a very interesting scheme where council tenants are encouraged to identify sites in their back gardens where they have large back gardens, and those tenants whose back garden is going to be made available for a site for a new home have a role in the nomination to that home. And those sites are then taken forward by the We Can Make organisation. We're also supporting a group to look at whether they can bring a scheme forward on a non-BCC owned site. We've been working with the hub and helping to support them in their role. And we're now releasing a second tranche of sites through our land disposal policy. And for that second tranche, we've secured funding through the Local Government Housing Advisor Programme, and we're using that to fund the input of architects who we've paired with community groups who've submitted expressions of interest on the sites. And so they're working with those architects to come up with concept designs to help them for their bids. And I'll just explain a bit more how that process works. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. So as I've said, part of our support for community-led housing has been the adoption of a policy. We call it the land disposal policy, adopted by Cabinet in February 2020. And that authorised the council to dispose of sites specifically for community-led housing. It defines the type of groups that can participate. So it defines the various legal forms that the community land trusts can take. And it sets out that the process must be transparent. It sets out a clear criteria that is used to assess the groups and assess their bids for the sites. And that includes a focus on social value and the deliverability of the scheme. So the sites are made available through our pro-contract system and the group's bid. With this second tranche of releases, we've done an expression of interest stage first, which has allowed us to identify that there is interest in the sites and, as I've said, to support those groups with the local advisor fund, housing advisor funded architectural input. So the groups become what we term preferred bidders, and that's important to note. So we don't go through a process where the group bids for the site and then takes on ownership of the site. The group become preferred bidders and then have to go through a further process through which we'll support them before they actually take ownership of the site. And if we can go to the next slide, please. So when they've been identified as a preferred bidder, we start to develop draft heads of terms for the land transfer agreement between ourselves and the Community Land Trust. The land transfer is generally on a leasehold basis, a long leasehold basis. That contract will come into play and will complete once the group has met various conditions, and the key condition being that they need to secure planning approval for their scheme and they need to secure funding. And to go through that process of securing planning approval, we're providing significant enabling support from myself, my team, and our property colleagues, because these are sites that belong to us and quite often have existing tenants and other management issues going on that we have to manage at the same time as supporting the group to take the site forward. And they also benefiting hugely from support from the West of England hub in terms of developing their policies, developing their financial plans, and working on their governance. As I've said, the transfer is on a long leasehold basis, and that sets out milestones for delivery. So, we expect them to deliver within a certain time frame. And another perhaps different thing about Bristol compared to some councils is that we have some affordable housing funding, capital funding for community-led housing, although that budget is more constrained than it was when this project was initially started. So there is some help for groups financially, and what that's led to is a position where not all of our community-led groups are planning to work in partnership with registered providers, which has itself kind of created another set of issues we've had to address, which I'll go on to in a minute. But first, I just wanted to give you some examples of the kinds of sites we're looking at. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So as I've said, we're a stockholding council. We have a lot of large sort of old style council estates with garages, with little plots of backland, with little kind of back access places, car parks and so on that we have identified as potential sites for community-led housing. So here you've got some examples, a car park that's underused, some garages, a garage site that are no longer used, and also a disused scout hut there. And as you can imagine, all of those existing uses give rise to really important aspects of community engagement by the community-led groups with the wider community. And as Louise said, not all of our community-led groups are groups who are identified by geography. Some of them are more identified by their aspirations, their shared kind of ideas of ideals and ideas about housing. So, for example, we have a tiny house group. And so they have to engage with the local community, which has certain challenges, I think, and that's a role where the hub, again, have been really important in supporting groups to do that. We go on to the next slide, please. I think we've missed a slide there. We should have a picture of the, oh, you've cut one. Okay, sorry, thanks. Yeah, so another site that's not here, there isn't a picture of here, but we have sites. One of the key issues we have on some of our sites is access. Is it suitable to actually have cars going in and out of the site? And that's led to challenges, but it's also led to creative solutions, which perhaps we wouldn't have got if these sites had come forward for, standard housing developers. So in the example of the tiny house scheme, their site in Sea Mills, the access very limited, and they're looking to do a car-free development to overcome that, which kind of fits with their focus on sustainability. So moving on then to that next slide. So a couple of case studies for you. One of the projects we're working on, this is part of our second tranche. So we've put this forward for expression of interest, and it's now available through our portal for formal bids. It's a disused, what was a mission hall of the local church in Barton Hill, which is an area of Bristol that's quite deprived. It's one of the first areas where there were high-rise council flats back in the 50s, and subsequently subject to considerable regeneration during the New Deal of Communities kind of phase of regeneration under New Labour in the early 2000s. and a community that's kind of changed over time and now has quite a large Somali population who've been kind of prime movers behind the interest in doing something with this site. So this hall has been just neglected to the point that it really is too expensive to refurbish it. And so we've put it forward as a site for redevelopment. We've also secured funding to do the demolition and asbestos removal through the One Public Estate Brownfield Land Release Fund. So that's helpful, but of course we do have to deliver housing as a condition of that funding. We're hoping that we'll be able to deliver about 8 flats and also community space on this site. That's very important. The Somali Resource Centre interest originally was more around could they use this for community activities, and that's something that we've made very clear in the invitation for bids, is that we want bids that include community space. We're engaging, as I've said, with the Bristol Somali Resource Centre, who have offices nearby and a strong kind of link to that community. And we're also engaging with the local history group. Barton Hill has an active local history group, and they're very interested in the history of this site and kind of supportive of it going forward, still with some sort of community space there, which is great. I think some elements of this are really good examples of where community-led housing can bring forward a site that has community meaning, but is challenging in development terms. And, you know, they're really well placed to work with the local community to take this forward. And there is concern in the community that they're losing a historic building, and we really need to address that in the design. So just next slide, please. The case study here for another one. This is Furs Housing Co-op. This is a very different site and a very different proposition, really. So it's 2 garage sites in the middle of Council Estate in Lockleys in Bristol, an area which has a lot of redevelopment going on. This is a community-led group who are a co-op. And unlike some of our other community groups, where they're more community anchor organisations who want to develop housing for their local community, this group want to develop housing to house themselves and other members. And that has thrown up quite a lot of challenges in terms of how we work with them, and yet also kind of work within our policy framework for allocation of affordable housing. And what they want to build also throws up some challenges. They're keen on, the idea is a co-housing scheme where there'll be considerable amount of shared space, and also individual kind of units which would be for the household. And they are also envisaging that would include children. So it has thrown up some questions around, you know, safeguarding and management and how that will actually work, and how high will the service charges be, and so on. They've also got aspirations for high standards of sustainability in their design. They kind of see what they're doing as a challenge to the typical way that the housing market works, and they want to show a way where they have a range of incomes on that scheme. So they're looking at a proposition where we might have social rented units, kind of intermediate rented units, and also market rented units. And so we're grappling with how the policy can accommodate that. You know, for example, will we release the site for nil value? I should have said that the expectation is, of course, that we release these sites for no consideration if they're for affordable housing, but that may have to be flexed if the mix includes some market housing. So next slide, please. So as I've said, aspirations for communal living, and we're working with them around also their management policies going forward and their allocation scheme. So how do you kind of combine a co-op where you have to be a member with principles of equality and diversity and being open to all? And so we found that it's important with these groups to really focus on the equalities and diversity elements of their policies and encourage them to have a strong policy framework to safeguard these just becoming kind of groups that are not open to other people and not kind of indirectly discriminatory in terms of their membership rules and so on. So it's challenging to balance that innovation, but we see that as important because that's part of what community-led housing can do, meet these different aspirations. Next slide, please. So this one's over to you, Louise.
Yes,
the role
Nick.
of the hub.
Thank you. So we've already touched on through a number of the presentations this afternoon about the community-led housing hubs that have been established across the country. And I think it's really true to say that we wouldn't be where we are in Bristol at the moment if it wasn't for the community-led housing West hub that is operating across the West of England Authority. Susan's going to be as part of the Q&A panel later, and so she's here also answering questions in the chat. But I think it's fair to say that the hub have been absolutely critical in facilitating communication between the council. You know, we are a public body, we're seen as quite officious, of course we are, but those communities, particularly as a number of our communities in the city have come up through the activist route we talked about earlier and are often at odds with what the local authority stands for. The hub provide those groups with access to enablers and professionals and consultants that as a local authority we just don't have the opportunity to do. They advise on so many of the key topics that are essential to bringing development forward, and actually even before the development work, to actually support groups coming forward to say we want to do something about community housing in our area, in our city, in our ward, or whatever that geographic area might be, and supporting those groups to become established. They provide a voice for those community-led housing groups, and they are pressurizing us quite a lot in terms of planning policy, for example, about how we can use the systems available to us to maximise development opportunities for the sector. They're providing very key targeted support, as Bryony's already said, to our disposals work, and they are providing independent support in terms of the grant funding bid. We can't be sort of supporting those organisations in their bid and then judging their funding bids. So the hub are absolutely instrumental in supporting us in that, and we've got 2 very specific commissions with them at the moment. They are supporting a strong pipeline of community-led projects in the city, and you know they, I'll say, essential to what we're achieving. But, and we'll come on to that in a bit later on, for the hubs to be successful, they need to have a regular revenue income stream. And we know we're working day in, day out with Susan and Steve Dale from BCOT to talk about that issue and how we can actually maintain the hub in perpetuity, or at least certainly for the sort of the longer term. Can we have the next slide, please? So what we just wanted to share with you before we finish our presentation is some of the learning that particularly Bryony and I have had over the last couple of years, and what we're trying to do as a local authority to mitigate some of the challenges that we've identified. So we've already spoken about the fact that we are actually able to release land. We're quite lucky in that sense because we are that stock holding authority. But it's true to say that many of the sites that we are releasing at the moment are some of the trickier brownfield sites. You know, they're not easy. They've often sat there sort of vacant for a while because nobody wants to develop them. They're not big enough for the local authority to bring forward, or our RP partners, and they have their challenges. So we are seeking to de-risk these sites as much as we can within the sort of capacity and the budgets we have available, doing a lot of that early work as we can around highways, around access, rights of way, and other planning challenges, looking at the opportunities to bid for other sources of funding. Bryony mentioned the Tenants Hall Brownfield Land Release Fund that we've secured there. We've got another community-led site that's in tranche 1 where we are doing all the work to upgrade the access because it just makes the scheme unviable, but it's absolutely essential if that land's going to come forward. We're actually helping to manage some of that early planning engagement. And as Bryony's already touched on, that local government housing association advisors programme funding, it's just helping us set these groups up in the right way so when this land is coming forward, they're able to actually make those schemes deliverable. Can we have the next slide, please? And Bryony, I think we're moving over to you on this one.
Yes, thanks. So just to counter through this really. So we've found that, as Louise said, it's been a learning curve for us, and we've inherited this policy and then had to implement it. What we're finding is, as we go, we need to clarify some of what we're saying in the policy, particularly what we mean by affordable housing funding, what can and can't be funded, particularly these challenges around groups who see this as an opportunity to house themselves and see themselves as being in need of affordable housing. But, you know, is that in need in terms of our allocations policy? So additional guidance around that, and a lot of work with debate really with the sector. We've also looked at, as I said, we have some groups who will not probably go forward with an RP, which means they would not be covered by the regulatory framework that covers registered providers. So we've created, with the consultation and engagement of the sector, the community-led sector, a set of kind of regulatory standards modelled on the standards for registered providers, but kind of scaled down and made more suitable for the sector. And that's actually been very useful, I think, in terms of getting groups to think about what the reality is of managing housing going forward and the kinds of policies they need to think about, the focus on equalities that I've mentioned and so on. It's really been labour intensive, but I think it's important that we've done that. And now that we've got that, we can use that as a benchmark to kind of test groups against when we're looking to assess whether they should take on a site and whether they should have grant funding. I think we've got one more slide.
One more slide. Just a very final key learning. For those of you who are looking at delivering on a sort of a greater emphasis on community-led housing, particularly if you're looking at bringing your own sites forward to make this work. For us, the big issues are the fact that we need, or the groups need, to have revenue funding to do that pre-development work on a site. You know, we as a local authority can do so much, but there has to be that revenue funding available for the organisations. And that there is risk associated with abortive pre-development work. You know, when we're working or talking to RPs, they have huge budgets. They have abortive cost allowances. If we're working with small organisations who are working almost day to day, week to week with what money they have available, the abortive pre-development work needs to be recognised and funded somehow. The hub is crucial. The expertise is crucial. The fact what they do for our community-led housing is essential. But if they can't access funding, and if our groups can't access that revenue funding, we don't have a community-led housing sector in Bristol. And also, just one for those of you with enabling teams who are picking up this alongside your other work, there is a capacity challenge. This is intensive in terms of what a local authority has to do to make this happen, compared with working with our RPs. But what we get from the community-led housing sector is something different and something so important. So I think it's about going into this with your eyes open and looking at capacity and doing your very best to make this work, challenging and getting what revenue streams, arguing for social value, and looking at all the other ways you can do all the other things you can do to bring these homes forward. And I was strong to say, I was in a workshop yesterday, it's not on the slide, on the workshop yesterday about the next phase of the Brownfield Land Release Fund, which is going to make affordable housing and community-led housing a monetized value, an asset within that. So it's really worth exploring what you can do to see if you can bring some of your sites forward. And we're going to hand over to Victoria now for the question and answer session.
Thanks, Louise. Thank you, Bryony, and thanks to all our speakers. If I could invite all of the speakers to come back onto camera, and it's time for our Q&A. So welcome back, all presenters. And I'd also like to welcome Emily Howard, Community-Led Development Advisor at East Cambridgeshire Council, and Susan Cataldi from Community-Led Homes West, as well as Helen Bone, who is from the Homes England Affordable Homes team. So we've got some great speakers, some great experts who can help us with some of your questions, and lots of questions have come in. The first one I'd like to put to Susan. So if I could ask all speakers to put their cameras back on so we can see you, that would be fantastic. And Susan, there's a question that came in around the work of hubs. And it asks, what enabling services do hubs provide, and how can LAs work with hubs to make the most of the capacity support offered? Over to you, Susan.
Thanks very much, Victoria. I think we've all mentioned it here, and I think it's been sort of from slide to slide, but the hub's role is to provide resources, a pool of accredited advisors who have real localized and regional knowledge that spans over years. So we've been able to pull together lots of technical help that is in the city and regionally that's been really, really helpful. Providing that technical support, capacity building for our groups, templates and resources, financial modeling apps that we can use and that we can help for tools for the groups, bid writing. I mean, it goes on, it's endless. It's almost from start to finish, from, as Tom said, starting conversations off in a pub and how do you get to development, and it is really capacity building. As a hub, we've been able to support some groups with funding, but as others have mentioned, that pre-development money isn't there. And those groups need that. They need the support. They need that funding to incorporate. They need to be able to write business plans. It's a lot of volunteer time. It's more than you would imagine. So, having that support and consistent support. And I think it's been mentioned here how valuable that is and really what's needed.
Thank you, Susan. I'm going to ask you to stay with us here for the next question, and I'd like to bring in Tom as well, and maybe you could answer this together. Because the question came in on who monitors the governance of the CLT once the development is completed, and that does speak to some of the things you've said, Susan, about the duration or length, lifespan of a scheme. And I know that you work with communities and local authorities after completion. So I wonder if you could tackle that, and then maybe Tom, you could come in with some of your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, this is about the governance, the membership of the group of the CLT. It can be done in different ways. Some groups can, and it's about capacity and what the CLTs want to manage. A CLT could manage it all. They could use an RP and help them manage, the homes. But really, it's that consistent governance and making sure that community is really working as a community. And I'm sure Tom will echo that in terms of how it's managed. It's longer than 100 years, that you could be managing homes. So that governance needs to be really tight.
Yeah, so the governance of CLTs really varies, and a number are themselves registered with the regulator for social housing, so they're governed through that. We are not a regulator of CLTs. We support them and provide training and access to resources and so on. And I think what you've seen from the two examples in Bristol and East Cambs is councils being aware of this issue in the way that they set up their support programmes, testing, ensuring that organisations are set off on the right foot. I think it also comes back to the role of the hub, and one of the things that we considered when designing programmes to roll those out was a previous experience with housing cooperatives set up in the 70s and 80s, where back when the Housing Corporation was funding them. And those that are still around today and still successfully managing and maintaining their homes are the ones that are supported by secondary housing co-ops. They have a support organisation at a regional level who can support them with good governance, financial management, asset management, and so on. And there's that role for us as a sector to establish ourselves as a kind of well-run sector rather than organisations that risk running into failure in 20 or 50 years' time.
So thanks, Susan and Tom. I'll go through to another question that's in the chat. And for this, it'd be good to get, Tom, if you could start us off, and then perhaps Bridget, Louise, Helen, one or all of you could come in with an example. So this question is more about the beginning of the life cycle, if you like, and it asks, how can we best ensure equity of access to the community decision-making process for all within that community who may not hold high levels of social capital? Should we start with some more broad thinking from Tom, and then Bridget, Louise, Helen, come in if you've got an example. Over to you, Tom.
Happy to. It's a really interesting question, and it's a question that we should be asking in lots of areas of policy and practice. And I know a lot of housing associations and others have also thought about this same issue. So we know, I mentioned that CLTs are overrepresented in more deprived areas, but we don't know whether the people who participate in and run those CLTs themselves are representative of that. You've got the most deprived people getting involved in them. we've run a project for the last few years supporting some CLTs to try to tackle this. And it raises really interesting questions, like if you're in immediate housing need, why would you want to get involved with an organisation that's just got started and might not complete any homes for 5 or 6 years? That's not going to help you very much. So at what stage in the life cycle of projects do people get involved? What sort of involvement do they have? And the short answer is basically you need to put money and time into that question as much as you put into, well, not as much, alongside putting time and effort into the question of how you build the homes, if you really want to build a diverse and equitable and inclusive organisation and approach to projects. And I think some of the stuff that's been happening in Bristol in the recent years has really identified this issue. So it'd be really interesting to hear from people in Bristol about this.
Yeah, so shall I just pick up on that? I mean, I think those of us who've worked in affordable housing for many years will say that this is something that we faced all along, is that the people that most need the homes that we secure the delivery of are those who are least empowered to get involved and speak for themselves. So whether you're working in rural housing, in an urban setting, in community-led housing, I think our job as part of working for the local authority, supporting the community-led groups and working with RPs, is to make sure that we are speaking for and enabling those people who are less empowered to have a voice. And I just think that's something that runs through affordable housing delivery more generally, not just for community-led housing. I think in Bristol, we've taken a very strong equalities-based approach to the organisations that we want to work with and support, whether that's through land disposals, whether that's through our grant funding. And Bryony mentioned earlier the governance, finance, the standards that we're working with. They are heavily based on an equalities approach to ensure that there is fairness and there's a voice that's going to be heard from those people who don't speak for themselves. And we'll do that, and we'll check that. We'll go back and check about what people are doing, making sure the policies are in place around equalities, making sure that community engagement is there. But what we are seeing in the main, we spoke about We Can Make earlier, although that wasn't part of our land disposals policy, is involvement, the grassroots involvement in delivery of those projects is huge. And it is coming from those people who most need a home or have identified people in their community who need a home. So we are seeing examples where that's happening.
Brilliant. Fantastic.
I'd just like, if I can just add there, I think one of the points to make there is deprived community doesn't mean to say a community can't, doesn't have the capital to do something about it. If you engage with that community, deprivation doesn't mean you're not capable. It's deprivation, and that's a really important thing to bear in mind when you're dealing with people. I think if you go out and talk to people, engage with people, they take up that challenge, and that's certainly what we're seeing in the Tenants Hall project, for example, which is turning out to be one where we've got probably more community engagement going on, because the community we're dealing with is a really strong community, although from outside people might say, oh, that's a deprived community. So I think it takes that kind of mindset really, and that's a really important thread that can run through community-led housing.
Brilliant. Thanks, Bryony. That's a good challenge and a good reminder. Okay, so I'm just conscious of the time, so I think this might have to be the last question. I'd like to put it to Anna and Emily. And a question came in about the groups that you were talking about. And the question says, how do these groups compete with the market to acquire the land? We find, this is the person who wrote it, most are getting outpriced by market developers. So I'm not quite sure about the geography there, but I think it's something that most people would recognise across the country. Anna and Emily.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Well, I mean, the sort of pure way of doing a CLT is that a community comes together because it has a need, a housing need that it wants to fulfil for its local community. And they have an aspiration of what they want to do, and they form their trust, and then they put out, a call for land, and land owners and developers can, submit their proposals, and that is a competitive process, which means that people are competing to be the chosen land, which means that you have an opportunity to extract more value from that land. And obviously it is land that is outside the development envelope, which, in rural East Cambs has an agricultural price. and you wave the planning wand over it, and it increases in value significantly, and the landowner can deliver open market houses. So, you know, it does create a competitive process. Not all our CLTs have started or worked in that way. Some have had a particular site already in mind. You know, and in the case of the MOD site, it was housing that already existed. So that they're all a little bit different. In terms of, you know, working with a developer, you know, we've got developers who have in East Cambridgeshire who have gained expertise in working with community-led development, which, you know, does give them an edge when people are looking for a developer to work with from the beginning, because, you know, it's a different way of doing development, and somebody to hold your hand along the way is incredibly valuable and helpful, that's been through it before. So that does give those developers an edge. But essentially, you know, they go out to market and put out a tender, and you know, look for the best builder. Don't know if Emily wants to add anything to that.
No, I think just echoing what Anna said then, and referring obviously back to our local plan, the supplementary document, which again is an extra incentive, I think, for these developers to work with the community. It's unlocking that additional land that might not come forward. And you know, in most of these areas, communities are keen to stand up and take control and have a say on the development that happens in their area. You know, community-led housing is more than about development happening to a community and a community leading it really from the inside. And it's, you know, establishing those relationships to bring forward successful developments.
That's a great way to finish the Q&A. Thank you so much. I know that there have been other questions that my colleagues from Homes England have responded to in the chat, as well as everybody else. So hopefully everyone has had their questions answered. If there's still something that hasn't been answered, if you could email the Local Government Capacity Centre, and we will forward those on within Homes England to get a response for you. If I could say a big thank you again to all of our speakers and to everybody for attending. If you want to get in touch with us, that's the Local Government Capacity Centre email address. Email us with any questions that weren't answered from the session. And if you'd like to know anything else about the work of Homes England meeting capacity needs of local government. Good afternoon, and we'll see you soon. Thank you. Goodbye.